Los Angeles, 1993. The hallway smelled like cigarettes and old carpet. Not the glamorous kind of old. Not vintage, not nostalgic. Just old. The kind of old that accumulates in places where too many people have passed through without leaving anything behind except their smoke and their ambition. Interscope's West Wing had 3 studios running that week. Studio A was booked through midnight. Studio B had been dark since Tuesday, when a session fell apart over a drum sample no one could agree on. Studio C, the smallest one, the one with the rattling ventilation and the couch that leaned slightly to the left, was where Tupac Shakur had been working for the past 4 days straight. He wasn't sleeping much. You could tell. His engineer, a quiet man named Darius, who had learned early that the best thing he could do in that room was stay invisible, would later say that Tupac, during those sessions, existed in a state that was almost frightening to watch. Not the anger everyone expected, something underneath the anger, something that looked, in the quieter moments between takes, like a man trying to outrun something he already knew he couldn't outrun. The album he was building would become strictly for my NIGGAZ. He didn't know yet what the next 2 years would cost him. None of them did. Kurt Cobain had come to Los Angeles for reasons he would have been hard-pressed to explain clearly, even to himself. The official reason was meetings. There were always meetings. His manager had a list. His label had a different list. His lawyer had a third list that overlapped with the first 2 in ways nobody had fully reconciled. Kurt had nodded through the phone calls and gotten on the plane, and now he was here, in a city he had never particularly liked, sitting in a rental car outside a building on Santa Monica Boulevard, trying to remember which floor he was supposed to go to. He had been staring at the building's entrance for about 4 minutes. A security guard near the door had glanced at the rental car twice. Kurt didn't move. The engine idled. The air conditioning made a sound like it was apologizing for something. Nevermind had sold 30 million copies. That number had stopped meaning anything to him around the time it crossed 10 million. At 30 million, it had become something that existed in a different dimension entirely. A dimension where Kurt Cobain, the cultural phenomenon, lived, a creature he read about in magazines, with the same detached curiosity he might bring to reading about someone else. The phenomenon had opinions about things. The phenomenon gave interviews in which he said words that were later quoted back at him in subsequent interviews, creating an Ouroboros of public self that had very little to do with the person sitting in the rental car with the engine on. He was 26 years old. His stomach hurt most mornings. He had a daughter who was 7 months old, and he loved her more than he had words for, which was saying something for a man who had spent his entire adult life finding words for things. He finally turned off the engine and got out. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The meeting ran long. It always ran long. By the time he was done and standing back in the corridor with his jacket over one arm and the particular blankness on his face that people who didn't know him well often mistook for boredom, it was past 10 o'clock and someone was playing bass through the walls of Studio C with a low, insistent pulse that he felt more than heard. He stood there for a moment, listening. The door to Studio C opened. Tupac came out of the studio the way he came out of most rooms, preceding himself. There was a quality to his physical presence that was difficult to describe without sounding like you were writing a press release, but it was real, and it had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with the particular way he occupied space. Like he had decided, sometime early in his life, to take up exactly as much room as he was entitled to, and not a single inch less. He almost walked past Kurt entirely. Then he stopped. He looked at Kurt the way you look at someone when your brain is registering something your eyes haven't fully processed yet. A half-second of lag between seeing and recognizing. Then recognition arrived, and something shifted in Tupac's expression. Not warmth exactly, not hostility. Something more complicated and more honest than either. "Cobain," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't unfriendly. It was more like an acknowledgement of a fact. "You exist. I see that you exist," delivered in the flat register of a man who had run out of social performance hours ago. Kurt looked up. "Hey." They stood there in the hallway for a moment. 2 men, 3 feet apart, a rattling ventilation unit above them providing an indifferent soundtrack. Darius, who had stepped out with Tupac to get water, found a reason to become very interested in the vending machine at the far end of the corridor. What happened next has been recounted a handful of times over the years, always secondhand, always filtered through the memories of people who were almost there, in the adjacent room, around the corner, hearing it described later that night. The accounts don't always agree on the specifics. They agree on the shape. Tupac said something about the music, about what Kurt was making, what it meant, who it reached. He was not entirely complimentary. He had opinions. He always had opinions, carved from direct experience and delivered without apology. And one of his opinions was that there was a difference between pain and the performance of pain, between bleeding and borrowing someone else's wound and wearing it like a costume. He didn't say it cruelly. That's the part that tends to get lost in the retelling. He said it the way you say something true that you know is going to land hard, with a kind of forward momentum that doesn't leave room for softening, a directness that was, in its own way, a form of respect. The respect of not pretending. Your audience, he said, they're grieving something they can name. Alienation. Feeling wrong. Not fitting. That's real. I don't take that from them. He paused. The ventilation rattled. But my people, he continued, and there was a heaviness in the word my, a weight that had been earned across years and zip codes in a childhood that had included hunger and fear in quantities that didn't fit neatly into 3-minute songs. My people are grieving things they can't survive, not things that make them feel misunderstood, things that will actually kill them. He looked at Kurt with an expression that was not contempt. It was harder than contempt and more specific. Your pain and my pain, he said, they're not the same thing. Kurt didn't answer right away. This was the part that Darius, getting water 30 feet away, heard without intending to. Not the words, but the silence after. A silence long enough to be its own kind of response. Later, when people asked Darius what Kurt said back, Darius would pause and look at a point in the middle distance before answering. He didn't argue, Darius would say, and that was all he would say about it. What Darius actually remembered, in the version he kept to himself, was something smaller and more specific. He remembered that Kurt looked at Tupac for a long moment with an expression Darius had trouble naming, not shame, not defiance. Something that seemed to come from a place beyond both of those. A place where the question of who had more right to their suffering had stopped being interesting, because the suffering itself had become all-consuming, regardless of its source or its legitimacy or who it belonged to by any reasonable accounting. He remembered that Kurt said something very quiet, 4 or 5 words. He wasn't close enough to hear them. He remembered that Tupac went still for just a second after those words. A stillness that was different from his usual stillness, which was the stillness of a man choosing his next move. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who has heard something unexpected and is deciding what to do with it. He remembered that they stood there for another moment, the two of them, in a hallway that smelled like cigarettes and old carpet, in a city that had not been kind to either of them in the specific ways each of them needed, with the bass still pulsing low and steady through the wall of Studio C. Then Tupac said something else. Darius caught the tone, if not the words. Something that was not an apology, but was adjacent to one. Something that acknowledged some kind of shared terrain. And he went back into the studio. Kurt stood in the hallway alone for maybe half a minute. Then he found the elevator and went down to the parking structure and sat in his rental car without starting the engine for a while, in the way he sometimes did when something had shifted inside him and he needed to let it settle before he could move again. Neither of them talked about it publicly. This was not remarkable. Both of them had a natural instinct for keeping certain things private. Not the public performance of privacy, which is its own kind of exhibition, but the actual kind where things simply go unspoken because some experiences resist the flattening that language does to them. They moved in different worlds mostly, different coasts, different genres, different gravitational fields of expectation and celebrity and danger. Their paths crossed occasionally in the peripheral ways that famous people's paths cross, through intermediaries, through shared spaces at industry events, through the fog of a music industry that was large enough to contain both of them, but not particularly interested in examining what they had in common. What they had in common was the following, though nobody was running the comparison at the time. Both of them were 26. Both of them were producing, in this period, work that would later be described as the defining expression of their respective careers and the thing they couldn't quite live up to afterward, or before it. The tenses got confused. Both of them were using their art as a container for something that had grown too large for it. Both of them were trying to say something true in a medium that rewarded truth only insofar as truth could be made to feel universal, which meant that the most specific and personal truths, the ones that mattered most, had to be translated into a language general enough to sell, and the translation always lost something. Both of them had grown up without the things that were supposed to be guaranteed. Not in the same way. The specific textures of deprivation were completely different, shaped by different geographies and histories, and the particular cruelties each world reserved for people who didn't fit its categories. But the absence itself had a shape they would have recognized in each other, if anyone had thought to hold the two shapes up side by side. Both of them were famous in a way that had made them less safe, not more. Fame had not solved the original problem. Fame had in some ways made the original problem harder to name, because when you are beloved by millions, the story is supposed to end there. The story is supposed to end with gratitude and perspective and the understanding that you have been given something precious. Neither of them had found the gratitude particularly accessible that year. Both of them were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Neither of them knew how to say this to anyone who hadn't already figured it out on their own. In September of 1994, Tupac was shot 5 times outside Quad Recording Studios in New York City. He survived. He would later describe what it felt like to believe you are dying on a floor while people step over your body, and the description would not sound like metaphor. In April of 1994, 7 months before that night in New York, Kurt Cobain died in Seattle at 27. By the time of Tupac's shooting, Kurt had already been gone for 5 months. The thing about that hallway in 1993 is that nobody thought to document it. Why would they? 2 musicians passing each other in a corridor after late sessions. One going back to work, one going down to a parking structure. The particular way that moment existed, fragile and specific and full of the kind of truth that doesn't announce itself, was invisible to everyone who wasn't standing there. The music industry is not designed to preserve fragile and specific things. It is designed to amplify and replicate, which are different operations entirely and often oppose the first one. What remains is the second-hand account of a quiet man who found a reason to be interested in a vending machine, and even that account has worn smooth over the years, rubbed down to its essential shape by the retelling. The shape is this: 2 people in a hallway, both trying to say something impossible, one of them speaking and one of them listening, and for a moment, just a moment, in the particular silence that followed, something was understood that had nothing to do with who was right. Darius retired from engineering in 2011. He still works in music, in a different capacity, in a city other than Los Angeles. He doesn't tell this story often. He is not the kind of person who collects experiences the way some people do. Not as currency, not as material. He keeps things until the keeping stops feeling right, and then sometimes he releases them, and sometimes he doesn't. When he does tell it, he tells it the same way every time, ending in the same place. The silence after Tupac spoke, Kurt's 4 or 5 words that he couldn't quite hear, the brief stillness in Tupac that followed. And he always stops there, before the parking structure, before the elevator, before everything that came after for both of them. I don't know what Cobain said, he told one interviewer years later, but I remember what it did to the room. He paused. Both of them were carrying something. That night you could see it. I don't know if they could see it in each other. I think maybe they could. He paused again. I think that was the whole thing.